Is it time to pack the Supreme Court again? I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And gentlemen, Democrat presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg, who is the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, has a proposal that he's been pressing for quite a while now during this campaign to make the court less political. And his proposal, guys, is basically to say, let's have 5 justices that lean Republican, 5 justices that lean Democrat, and then let's have those 10 people appoint another 5 justices at their mutual agreement, so that we would have at least balance on the political party representatives, and then that middle group of 5 other justices ostensibly would be one that would be palatable to either side, meaning non-political, and that it would take the politics out of the court. And Stephen Green, let's just take that to begin with. I have another proposal too, but and I may let you jump in on that one as well. But just on the face of it, doesn't it seem reasonable and frankly surprising that a Democrat would suggest a way to depoliticize the Supreme Court?
Was that to me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm sorry, your audio dropped out for just a second, so I wasn't sure if that was
it
me or
did,
Bill.
yeah.
Yeah, well, this isn't a plan to depoliticize the Supreme Court. This is a plan to politicize it more in what he perceives to be his favor, at least for the moment. These temporary schemes to correct the system not working in my favor before. We're going to change the rules so that it's going to work. It's going to continue to work in my favor in the future. That's almost entirely what this is. It reminds me entirely of Democrats suddenly discovering on about November 9th, 2016, that the Electoral College was outdated and needed to be replaced with something that would elect more Democrats. So, no, I don't trust his motives. I think it's a stupid plan. That said, maybe there's some room for improvement on the Supreme Court. The court has powers that I believe were not intended by the founders. And so you have 9 people who are extremely important, probably more important than any 9 people in the world should be. And so maybe there's a way to try and rebalance that. Glenn Reynolds had an idea, I want to say this was last year, maybe 2 years ago, for expanding the Supreme Court. You keep the 9 members that we have now that are selected in the exact same way that we have now. You know, we talk about how the court is political. You can't take the politics out of the court for the same reason you can't take the sex out of a hooker. It's a government institution. It's going to be political. I'm not actually saying they're hookers or whores or anything horrible like that. I'm just saying it's intrinsic.
But you could make a case.
There are certain members that certainly maybe more so.
Speaking up on behalf of hookers, my people take that as an insult.
And you probably should. I expect a prostitute to return fair service for my dollar. Well, hopefully not my dollar, but you know what I mean. I don't expect the same out of anybody appointed by any politician. Sometimes I get it, and that's great, but it's nothing I really expect. Anyway, Glenn's idea was to expand the court by 50 justices. Which would, wow, that'd be a lot more democratic. So you've got the with a small d, you've got the core 9 who are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and then you'd have 50 more appointed, 1 each by the governor of each of the 50 states for some sort of term limit, 6 years, 12 years, 18 years, whatever the term limit was. Not only appointed by the governor of each state, but approved by the assembly of each state. And then, and this is the beautiful part, this might bring us back to a little bit of federalism, subject to repeal by the vote of their home state assembly. So you'd have a much bigger court where you've got diluted powers simply because you've got a lot more people voting on each case. And then you've got the idea that state governments are going to have a say in the Supreme Court by being able to recall justices off the bench if they interfere too much, presumably, in state business.
Well, there's
just an idea.
There's another proposal by a guy named Matt Ford, who wrote in the New Republic an article posted early in June. And Bill Whittle, this is a guy who's being critical of Pete Buttigieg's suggestion, saying basically that's not going to make it less partisan. And so what we should try to do is not let one side or the other win these judicial wars, but we should just get out of the business of having judicial wars. There are some 11 circuit courts around the country, plus the District of Columbia. And so Matt Ford's suggestion is that when there's a vacancy on the court, that it would be supplied by a lottery drawing from each circuit. So if a judge from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals leaves the court, they would do a random drawing from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals to replace that justice. And those people would have a limited term. Perhaps it's been proposed maybe 18 years or some other period of time. They'd have a limited term. The Chief Justice would still be appointed by the President of the United States. And when the Chief Justice was done his term, he could go to whatever circuit court he wanted to, because the appellate court judges would have lifetime tenures, but the Supreme Court justices would not. Now, Bill, I know both you and Steve have indicated that we should go after the motives of the people who are making these proposals. In doing so, are you saying that the way that the Supreme Court is set up is the perfect incarnation of judicial probity and nothing can be done to improve it? Or are you willing to listen to reason?
I'm always willing to listen to reason, but the devil doth quote scripture, and that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to listen to every argument that comes down the pike. The first thing to say about this is, it once again, and I simply stand in awe of it. I never will understand it. I don't expect to. But once again, the Constitution is vague in an area where it seems like being a little vague is good. To most people's surprise, the Constitution does not say that the Supreme Court shall consist of 9 justices or any number of justices other than a Chief Justice. There has to be a Chief Justice, and the rest of the numbers are up to, I don't even know who. I guess the President would make the decision.
It's Congress.
Was it Congress the number of justices?
Yes.
Okay. So what they've done basically is they've said the will of the people will not only be done through the electoral process, but through the judicial process. They will have the ability to change the number of people on the courts. And that just amazes me. And I think it's really very wise. So now down to the specifics. Since there is no legal number of justices on the Supreme Court, the President can appoint, the Congress can approve as many as they want to. We've had 9 justices since 1868. Now the Democrats are trying to change that system because for the first time in 3 generations, there's a chance that the court will not be their giant bludgeon to cudgel the American people into believing what they believe. And so now that the court is actually in danger of becoming a neutral, if not conservative court, all of a sudden it has to go. Same thing with the Electoral College, as was pointed out earlier. This is the thing about our opponents that I find most disgraceful and dishonorable, and makes me realize that the idea of honor is just simply not there. It's not that they're doing dishonorable things. They don't get it. They don't see it. The idea that we're going to change the rules every time that we play a game by the rules, and if by playing by the rules means we lose, instead of losing, we change the rules again so that the rules now favor us so that we never lose. And that's exactly what they're doing here. There's nothing wrong with the system that's been working so far, other than the fact that the Supreme Court should, in my reading of the Constitution and the foundational papers, the Supreme Court was never going to decide if a law was constitutional or not. If the law passed through Congress and was signed by the President, it was constitutional by definition. And that the remedy to bad laws was to change your lawmakers and get new laws every 2 years. You get to flush the whole house. So this whole thing about, we need to find a better way. We need to find a better way because now it's 5-4, and if Ruth Bader Ginsburg doesn't survive her encasement in carbonite, it'll be 5-3. If they approve a conservative, it'll be 6-3, but that'll never happen. They would simply rather have that seat empty until they have the power to win the court back. And the final thing I'll say about that, this is this. This is why this is so important. The court is the weapon that the left has. In order to get their policies in place, they would have to get the majority of Americans to vote for them through their representatives, and that has never happened and never will happen. And so the left has used the Supreme Court to basically nullify laws that they don't like, to legislate laws that they do like, even though those laws could not have passed through Congress, which is where they're from. If the left loses the court, they lose the game. And they cannot lose the court, which is why we're seeing these predictable shows of, you know what, we got a better idea. Actually, you know, we should go back and look at that election and see how many hairdressers voted for Hillary Clinton. You know, and that's how we'll determine the thing. This business of moving the goalposts is shameful and disgusting, and I would refuse to countenance any look at it simply to deny them the satisfaction of this never-ending dishonor that they seem to cover themselves in.
Hey, Scott.
Yeah, I was.
Bill just get.
Let me throw this to you, Steve, because, and you can say what you wanted to say in conjunction with this. But it seems to me that when the court was completely in the hands of the leftist judges, that we might have been a lot more open to reform in the judiciary. Or are we now looking in hindsight and saying, well, we were always just the honorable people who wanted to win elections and by that means replace the judges?
Because we were. I can't recall a single measure from the 1950s on, which would be what the Warren Court and all that, a single huge push from the right, from the conservatives, from the libertarians, to restructure or reform the Supreme Court just because we weren't getting our way. Instead, we did the hard grassroots work of not just getting new justices on the Supreme Court, but of restructuring the Republican Party in such a way that it could win elections and win the Senate and get more of our people on the Supreme Court. So I'm just going to call BS on the whole premise of your follow-up there, Scott.
And I'm going to call BS on the other half, because if we were to have a 6-3 or a 9-0 conservative court, I would not want that court to legislate from the bench, and I would not want that court to make a decision about constitutionality of laws that it has no business making a decision about. If the thing were to become the weapon of the conservatives, I would not change my rules of its behavior, nor would I change what I want it to do. I want it to function the way it was determined in the Constitution. And I would not all of a sudden be in favor of Supreme Court nullification or any of this other stuff. I would want the court to send these issues back to the legislation where almost all of them belong. So, yeah, I'm with Steve on this.
Well, and if I can share with you my really terrible idea that I thought of while Bill was reminding us about how the number of justices is determined by Congress, instead of expanding the court, maybe we need instead to limit it. Let's take out 2 justices. We're going to narrow it down to 7 by an act of Congress, except instead of Congress saying, last in, first out, they're going to set up a battle royale where the first 2 to die in hand-to-hand combat are the ones to lose their seats. And I'm telling you right now, this would be a bipartisan thing because you're going to lose a Democrat and a Republican. Bader Ginsburg is going to be the first to go because she's half dead already. And then Chief Justice Roberts would be out because he has no spine, can't fight.
And we could call it Thunderbench. 9 justices enter, 7 justices leave.
Thunderbench.
And that'd be as good as the random selection of judges that Mayor Pete has selected, which we could do with a giant ball of giant transparent sphere, and Taylor Swift could come down and there'd be floating ping pong balls, and he'd twist a little lever, and one would come out and say, "Hey, you are a Supreme Court justice."
Second prize,
it's got nothing to do with
knives.
Nothing to do with you being the leading judicial minds of the country anymore. Because the leading judicial minds of the country now are arrayed against the progressives.
Well, the interpretation of language is an inherently political act, even if you would find the most virtuous people in the country to do it. You just simply cannot suspend who you are and then dispassionately examine a text and come up with a decision regarding that text that is completely contrary to the way that you have previously thought or would desire it to come out. I'm not saying it's impossible to to do that, but it is virtually impossible to do that. The best judges that we have are those who basically put the text above themselves and say, look, I am a servant to the text, not the other way around. And so my job is to try to figure out what this text means, what it meant to the people who wrote it and ratified it, and how that relates to the case before us. Now, ideally, the Supreme Court should be a case-driven institution, not a legislative body, not a body that's constantly sitting in judgment over the Congress, but a body that is deciding cases that couldn't be decided at lower levels or over which no other court has jurisdiction. Maritime cases involving foreign entities with people in the United States, cases between states and the like. And so in my fantasy world, all we have are a bunch of devoted textualists who look at the Constitution's words and try to determine what they mean in the context of the current case. Now, the Supreme Court has appellate jurisdiction in most cases, so it's deciding something that's already been decided. And it's always been a wonder to me that some of the wisest people in the country, the best educated legal minds in our country at the appellate court level, all federal judges all have somehow come to a decision that is exactly contrary to another group of judges who sit at a slightly higher level to them. And so just that fact alone should tell you that there's a certain amount of witchcraft in this process. I mean, it's not a pure science. It is a matter of human ideas, human interpretations, and therefore is beset with the fallen nature of humanity and our own inability to be able to judge rightly. That said, I think, as my colleagues have suggested, if the Supreme Court's purview were smaller than it is, then it wouldn't be as big a deal who served on the Supreme Court, and we wouldn't be as concerned with entrusting the executive officer of the federal government with those appointments and that small body of the U.S. Senate with the confirmation of those nominees. But putting the genie back in the bottle at this point is a little bit more than one might hopefully imagine could happen. Once you've said, essentially, that the Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter when it comes to constitutionality of laws, then to tell the court that you want it to get back inside the bottle is to basically invite them to reject that again. Any law passed to constrain the power of the Supreme Court would, of course, be found unconstitutional. And so I think the best we can hope for is to accomplish as much as we possibly can at the local and state level and push the authority and decision-making power down to local and state level when it comes to governance, and try to prevent creating test cases for these 9 justices, or frankly 5, and when it comes right down to it, 1 guy in a black robe who provides the swing vote in these cases. I don't think Pete Buttigieg's idea is anything beyond a utopian fantasy. Even if I don't question his motives, I don't think it can work. I actually like Matt Ford's idea at the New Republican more than Pete Buttigieg's, because at least you're randomly drawing people from the federal bench. But ultimately, you're not going to make it a non-political body. You're not going to make it something that's going to always be predictable and come out the way you expected. I'm looking at you, John Roberts. So for Bill Whittle and Steve Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.